I think that you can be very passively aggressive sometimes.
Really? Why?
I don't know, maybe it's something in your voice. Like, when I can't really tell if you are being sarcastic or honest most of the time.
I'm English. I can disguise my passive aggressiveness behind a veneer of polite irony.
So is it an English thing then? Hiding sarcasm behind politeness and hiding emotions in general?
Of course, because we are taught to keep a stiff upper lip. This isn't a podcast with all the answers.
It's a conversation about figuring things out as you go.
From two very different generations.
With Michelle R. Williams
and Nick Hurst.
Welcome to Life Happens. Another week, another episode, and yet another idiom. And we are not even surprised anymore. And this time, it made it even to the name of this episode. So, to explain?
Well, keeping a stiff upper lip. Yes, it's an idiom traditionally associated with the British, or mostly the English, who were brought up to not show emotion, which was considered a sign of weakness in the face of adversity. But the phrase actually comes from America. It first appeared in a book in 15. I can't remember the name of it now, but I have done my research on this. It later then appeared in the very famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it made it into an American dictionary in the mid-1800s. Anyway, that's enough of the history lesson. What does it actually mean? Keeping a stiff upper lip means showing courage, resolve, and not displaying emotion like sadness or fear, when facing difficult or upsetting situations, reflecting a traditional image of the British. But as I say, it's a lot more international than that.
Speaking of Brits and Americans, once again, which we, by the way, did in the last episode, and we are coming just back to it. This whole topic of this episode was born when I was telling you about this reality TV show that I was watching, which is on Netflix, I believe. And for those who don't know it, it's called Love is Blind, and you didn't know it before. Now you do, which is actually quite funny, and I still need you to watch it sometimes. For those who don't know it, it's basically a dating reality show where people date each other without ever seeing each other. And there are two groups of people, men and women, and they are basically talking to everybody there. And they see if they will click with someone, and then eventually they are more with that person and they are building that relationship without ever seeing each other. And if they build some kind of connection, they get engaged, again, without seeing each other. And only after they are engaged, they see each other for the first time. And then, they are going on honeymoon and they are going back into their real life and so on to see if their relationship will survive in the real life. And if it does, it ends with them actually getting married after a very short time. It's like, I don't know, 2 months, maybe something like that. It's a very short time. And
has that ever happened?
The whole point
has anybody ever got married? You're the expert on this.
Yes. Usually, I watched every single series of the American and British version, and usually it ends up with like 5, 6 couples actually getting engaged and going on the honeymoon and going back into their real lives. And out of those 6 couples, usually, 4 of them make it to the wedding and they get married. And then the very last episode is a reunion episode, which is after a year. Most of them get divorced.
Oh, there you go.
But to be fair, there's usually one couple in each season that stays married.
Question: what has that got to do with keeping a stiff upper lip?
What it has to do with this, it's that me being a huge fan of that show, I watched it because originally the show is American. And a couple of years ago, there was a British version, which only has like 2 seasons now. The American one has like 8 or 9 or something like that. But obviously, I watched the British as well. And I was watching it both at the same time. There was a new season of the American one, a new season of the British one. So I was sort of watching it at the same time. And what I noticed was how differently these two nations just perceive emotion. And you could just see it on these people. And for me, part of it while I'm watching it, obviously, part of it is the drama, but part of it while I'm watching it is that I love people watching and I love analyzing behavior of certain people. So that's something I really enjoy about it. And I noticed how, in general, you have like 30 people, and in general, everybody was behaving so differently in the British version, apart from the American version. And then that sort of made me think, because now that, I know that, it's sort of very obvious to me, but you don't really tend to think about it like that. And so, me being the psychology nerd I am, I've done research on the topic, and I was sort of started seeing how different cultures express emotions. And we already kind of established that in the last episode that English people and Czech people are quite similar in certain ways. And obviously, we can't really talk about any other nationalities. So, what I kind of want to talk about is the difference between Czech culture or Slavic culture, if we want to take it more in general, English people, English culture, and Americans. Because, funnily enough, I was watching the TV show when I was in America, and it wasn't just people in the reality TV show, it was people in general. And often, me being Czech, uh, the difference between me and Americans was very obvious in that way. So that's how the topic came to life, and that's what I want to focus on today.
Well, it's true that in Britain and growing up in the southeast of England, it was a pervasive part of culture that you didn't show emotions. And I do think, thinking back to my very early school days, that it was the kind of thing that if you did show emotions, if you got upset about something, that your teachers would just tell you in a very fierce, scary way, just pull yourself together, boy. And that was it for, mental health care. So I think we have become a lot more emotionally tolerant and emotionally fluent as well. So that on the one side, we're being tolerant of other people's emotions. On the other side, we are able more to express our emotions. And I think just briefly to go back to something that we said in a previous episode, the first time I really noticed this as being a part of British culture that had clearly changed was after the death of Princess Diana, when there was this huge outpouring of grief from the whole nation. And it literally brought the UK to a halt for a week. For example, the leading breakfast radio show, the BBC, Radio 1's breakfast show, which would normally be very, very upbeat, very full of humor, very upbeat music, very irreverent. For the whole week, there was none of that. And it was just like playing very solemn music. And that was just like such a major change. Plus, there was the outpouring of grief shown by people bringing flowers and placing them outside Buckingham Palace in London. And that wasn't planned. It just happened spontaneously. People just did that spontaneously. And the Queen then was actually quite confused by all that because, she and her family were very old school. They were very, let's keep a stiff upper lip about this. Let's not confront the emotion of the situation. So keeping a stiff upper lip, the reasons for that, the idea that you should show resolve and courage in the face of difficult circumstances, maybe, there's a place for it. But in the modern world, we now know more how to confront our emotions, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And, despite the cultural differences, obviously, people and society evolves. So nowadays, obviously, it's much better than it was several years ago. And, again, obviously it also depends on every single person and their upbringing and their experience and so on and so on. So, once again, we don't want to generalize here. But despite that, and despite um, the emotional awareness nowadays being much better than it was, just something like 10 years ago, because I think the growth is rather quick now. I think that you can still see the difference between cultures. And, like we can only judge like what, 3 countries here and maybe like Europe in general comparing to America. But I have the key elements here. So the first one is expression versus containment, which basically means if showing emotions is valued or discouraged. The next one is verbalization, which basically means if emotions are talked about explicitly or if they are only implied.
Oh, yeah, that's what the Brits do. We imply it, we don't express it.
Exactly. A key difference. The next one, again, quite obvious, but also one that I think changed with, the modern world, and that's emotion literacy, which is how people are educated in, first of all, mental health stuff, but also how aware and how smart they are in reading their own emotions and then eventually speaking them out loud. Then it's social function, which is if emotions are more of a social tool or if they are something you just keep private and keep with yourself. And then it's intensity tolerance, which is how much is too much for your society and for people around you. So these are some of the elements that you can use to judge how your country or your culture or even your social circle perceive emotions. And when I read that and when I was thinking about it, I sort of made my own picture about the UK, about Slavic countries, and about the USA. So I think that the UK and Slavic countries, which again we sort of established we are very similar in certain ways, and especially in showing emotions. And I think we are very private about it. But at the same time, I feel like we are more in touch with emotions within ourselves. We won't be really sharing it with people, but we know how to take care of it ourselves. While Americans, on the other hand, are more loud about it and they will tell everybody. But because I feel like, especially lately, it's been a question of a trend because I feel like people, not only in America, but people in general, are using words like valid or being in touch with emotions and like, I won't be doing this because I feel like this, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. Like being able to articulate your emotions and your feelings is a good thing. But at the same time, I feel that the more you focus on telling people around you, the less space you have to focus on the actual feeling within you and to actually learn about it and understand it. So I think that's the key difference between these two cultures and these two mindsets that we'll be comparing here. But, who am I to judge English people if I have an English person here? So, give us more details about how you think that English people, even nowadays, perceive emotions.
Well, thinking about what you were just saying and then contrasting it with how there was this big public outpouring of emotion when Princess Diana died. But if you narrow it down to go to a more individual level, I think it's true to say that British people, and I'm really, when I say British, I really have to sort of emphasize that I'm talking about English people because I'm English. And there are cultural differences between English people, Scottish people, Welsh people, and people from Northern Ireland. So I'm really talking about English people here. And I think that we are still uncomfortable with displays of emotion, either from ourselves, and we try to avoid it, and we try to avoid conversations that will be too emotionally open. Maybe there's a better way of expressing that. And also, we're uncomfortable when other people are showing emotions. That would be the kind of go-to reaction. It would be to kind of withdraw a little bit from a very emotional situation, an emotional outburst, or someone showing emotion through their actions, like crying maybe, or showing it through their words and the things that they say. And words are very, very dangerous things, because once you say something, it can never be unsaid. Still, I think, despite the fact that we are in a more emotionally literate age, still people will keep a stiff upper lip at times. It's still very much part of the psyche, British personality, just to be
Yeah.
very, I'm obviously completely generalizing there. And within that, there's a lot of people who are very emotionally literate, either in being able to express their emotions, or better still, being able to cope with other people who are expressing their emotions. That is something I have total admiration for, because I believe that, that there are many, many situations where it's much better to express your emotions. As I remember visits, very rare, I'm happy to say, visits to hospitals. One of the catchphrases that nurses would always use: better out than in. And that's the same applies to emotions, better out than in. But to be the person that then has to cope with that, that's really hard. And so I have tremendous admiration and respect for people who can actually deal with somebody who's having some sort of emotional crisis or emotional outburst, because I know that I'm not really very good in those sort of situations.
Funnily enough, I'm someone I feel that I deal with others people's emotions better than my own. And I don't know, maybe that's why I'm meant to be a therapist. But back to what you were saying, because, from my observation of English people, either in general or the people I've met, I think it's a lot about self control, because we all feel terrible sometimes and we all just want to scream and cry and swear. But I feel like English people really, really have a good self control in that. And also, I feel like between similar cultures, not just English people, but between cultures that are similar to that, I think there's something like almost like a subtle mind reading, that it basically creates an elephant in the room, that you are talking to someone and they are hinting at something and they do, but you also know that neither of you want to voice it and create that open conversation about it. So I think it's sort of subtle words and looks that you both acknowledge it, but just sort of do nothing.
Yeah, that's very true. Good point.
What I meant to say by that is that feelings may be more abstract than personal, that you are talking about it like, oh yeah, if someone feels this way, what do you think about it? Instead of saying, oh yeah, I feel this way. And
Yeah.
also, what I learned from English people, and again, not to name names, but you mostly, is that you guys just hide everything behind something else, which is something we already mentioned. And I feel like, emotions are hidden behind sarcasm, or different things, like rude things are hidden behind politeness or behind this specific English type of humor. And so at the end of the day, you can't really tell what the person is actually thinking. And that's something I even observed in that reality show, when Americans were like, oh yeah, I feel like this because I think he has feelings for someone else. And British people were just so subtle about it. Then I was watching it from my point of view, and I thought, like, wow, this guy really likes this woman. And then he was like, oh, I don't like her at all. I was just being polite. And I was like, oh, I would fall for this too. Jeez, okay, good to know.
No, I think that's very true and very fair, that British people do not exactly hide, but we have this culture of being very, very polite the whole time. Even when you're saying something absolutely horrible, you try to couch it in terms that somehow are socially acceptable. And again, it's part of the not showing fully your emotions. For instance, we will often start sentences when we're in kind of awkward situations, not necessarily really personal conversations with somebody that we know deeply and maybe love deeply, but with relative strangers, everyday type conversations will often start with the word sorry. Sorry, but I just wanted to say you can't actually do that. We're not remotely sorry. It's just simply a way of starting off a sentence where you're perhaps going to make a criticism or complain about something. Other phrases that we would perhaps use to start sentences are like, excuse me, oh, please, I just want to do things like this. And we do use the words please and thank you a lot, a lot. And it would be considered very rude not to. So even when you're being very rude to somebody, you would still maybe use a thank you. Really? You did that? I think that is absolutely terrible. Please don't do that again. Thank you. That would be, that would be a way of criticizing someone. People say,
Right. That's exactly the passive aggressiveness that I was talking about. Please don't do that. Thank you.
yeah,
Can't you hear it?
yeah, but that's to me is perfectly normal. I mean, people say the British never say what they mean. Of course we don't. We say everything other than we mean. You've got to listen for the spaces between the sentences to actually know what
Literally.
British people mean. And we have loads and loads of phrases that help us do that. And over the coming weeks, we should try to explore some. As I remember them, I'll write them down. Of course, now I'm talking about it, I can't think of a single example, but it
Of
is true
course.
that the way that British people speak is we approach subjects indirectly. Basically, I think it's a form of defense. Whereas I
Mm,
think with Americans in particular, and we've mentioned this already, tend to be a lot more direct and therefore seem much more honest as a result, which is probably good for them. And British people are always sort of thinking, what do they really mean? And go away totally confused. And actually, probably the British people themselves are totally confused. Often depicted very well in films showing the difference between the cultures. One film that I think a lot of people will be familiar with, where the writer very, very deliberately set out to write a film that showed the difference between the emotional expressions of English people and Americans, and that film was Four Weddings and a Funeral, which was written by a guy called Richard Curtis, who's English. But he wanted to show this big difference, and therefore his main female protagonist was American, and of course Hugh Grant, quintessential Englishman, was the male protagonist.
So, speaking of that, I have this perfect example of highlighting the difference between British culture and Czech or Slavic culture, and that's by a simple answer, which you will now give me. If I ask you, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you? I know what you did
Surviving,
there.
thank
I
you.
know what you did there.
Because I already told you, because this is one of the differences between, and you share it with Americans, and it's something that I couldn't get used to for a very long time. When people ask you, how are you? They don't actually care. You guys are saying instead of hello, how are you? Fine, thank you. If you had the worst day of your life, you would still reply, I'm fine, thank you. Why? What's the reason for that? Literally. Like, come on.
That's the stiff upper lip showing. It really is, because you don't share your deepest problems, fears, emotions with strangers or people that you've just met or people that you just started a conversation with, even if you know them really well. I used to do this in schools, and I must have done it with you, with my pupil, many years ago, that I would say to people, English speaking people, and I'm mainly focusing on people from Britain and America here, when they greet each other, they will always say, Hi, how are you? And the answer is always the same. It's, I'm fine. And I would say to the kids in school, even if your leg is falling off and blood is pouring out all over the place, you're still, I'm fine. How are you? Actually, maybe
That's
if your
just
leg is
insane.
falling off, you might say, I'm okay, although I've got a little problem here with my leg. kind of falling
Would
off.
you mind calling an ambulance for me, please?
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, exactly.
That's something I'm still not used to. After, being so in touch with English language and culture and after spending certain time in America, I still can't do that. I feel like Czech people have something similar, but it's the other extreme. Because I don't think you will ever hear a Czech person, even when it's a stranger, answer, "Oh yeah, I'm fine, I'm okay, I'm all right." No, we always focus on the most negative thing. The most common answer that you will get is, surviving. Always. Even when it's a stranger, even when you are going to a shop and you get asked, "How are you doing?" I feel like people at that moment always remember the most terrible things about their life. And so it's like, yeah, work is hard and like, all the stress around Christmas and so on and so on. You always mention the negative thing. But to be fair, I actually prefer it because either you can react to it or you don't have to. If someone tells you, "Oh yeah, I'm doing miserable," you don't have to be their therapist and ask them, "What can I do for you?" This and that. No, you usually just go like, "Yeah, man, same," and you move on. So basically, it's also a small talk, an unimportant talk, but at least we are a little bit honest.
While you were speaking just now, there's another expression, a real typical English expression, and that was mustn't grumble. And grumble, do you know that word? It's a marvelous word, just kind of means mutter away about things that are bad in your life, and it's just is a real expression that people use. And if you listen to, actually, there's a famous song called, I think it's Lazy Sunday from the 1960s by a band called the Small Faces. And in it, there's a line where the singer is singing to a lady, his next door neighbor, and says, "Good morning, Mrs. So and so. How are you doing?" or something like that. And you hear this old lady's voice going, "Mustn't grumble." I mean, that phrase, those two words, mustn't, short for must not, grumble, that tells you everything you need to know about the British, because must, it's an order. I could grumble, but I mustn't. So, and that's kind of how English people will feel. So if somebody says, "Mustn't grumble," it means that there's loads of things wrong in their life, but they're somehow socially not allowed to talk about it. So that's kind of how we are, if I may speak on
That's
that.
crazy. That's crazy. I don't think I was ever well enough in my life to answer, "Oh, I'm doing really well right now," when someone asks me how I'm doing, ever. But, if you guys feel like it, good for you at the end of the day. Czech people could never, Slavic people could never. And to be fair, on one hand, it maybe seems or sounds a bit depressing, but I think that Slavic cultures are more in touch with the negative emotions, but not in the way to complain all the time or be miserable all the time, but in a way that we don't think it's a taboo. It's normalized in the way that it's just socially acceptable because we all know that life can get very hard sometimes, and sometimes you just don't really know how to deal with it. And we all know it, and we all accept that you don't have to lie to me if your life is hard. Or I think in general, we are more in touch with the negative emotions like, grief and pain and so on and so on, than we are with the positive emotions. And one very perfect example for that is Russian literature. If you compare different literatures, different authors around the world, you don't have to study it to know that the Russian one is rather depressing. If you ever read something or even heard about Dostoevsky, you just know that this guy wasn't writing happily ever after. So I think that's a very good picture of how in touch we are with negative things. And on one hand, it might seem depressing, but I don't think it is. I think it's even more important to be able to voice and being in touch with your negative emotions than it's with the positive ones. But unfortunately, the sort of negative side of that is that I feel like in my culture, you often mistaken suppressed emotions for strength. You know, like because we are in touch with the negative things, but at the same time, as English people are, we are not very vocal about it, even about the negative stuff, even though it's much easier with these. But we are still keeping it within ourselves a lot. And then we are sort of perceived as these very strong people, even though when you are aware that something negative is happening in that person's life, but because the person is not talking about it, you immediately see them as this strong person who is handling everything very well, even though it's not true. They are just not voicing it. So I think that's the only thing that I wish we were more like Americans in voicing it. But we are more like English in this.
It's a very good point, actually, and well phrased, that people think that suppressing emotion is actually showing strength. It's not. It's actually making yourself mentally weaker. So that is an issue. Now, just sort of going back to what we were talking about before and differences maybe between different countries, but also similarities, how we perhaps find it difficult to express our emotions. We often use, and it has become a cultural thing across the world, third-party agents to do it for us. What do I mean by that? Songs. How many songs, popular songs, are actually about sadness and negative emotions to do with love, unrequited love, or love that has gone wrong? We use these things as third-party agent that helps us get our emotions out. How often have you watched a movie or even listened to a song and it's made you cry, or it's at least helped you get your emotions out? Because I believe that's always a good thing. It's that thing that I'd said a little bit earlier. When you go to hospitals, nurses will always tell you, better out than in, which in some cases can be rather disgusting, but it's at the same time with emotions, it's helpful. It is. It can nurse.
It's about art in general, you know, and not just music or movies. It's any form of art.
Yeah.
And one thing is being able to relate to something, to a song, to a movie, to a book. But to be fair, as an artist myself, I love expressing my personal struggles in my art. Currently, it's in my book. Sometimes I feel like it's too personal, so people who know me will probably know what I mean by certain parts of it. But that's absolutely what I love in art. And to be fair, being an artist my whole life, being a dancer, a painter, you know, studying art, being a writer, I'm always doing the best art when I feel miserable. The more terrible I feel, the better my art is. And on one hand, maybe that's quite sad, but on the other, at least you get something from it. You know, I'm feeling terrible. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what do I do with it? And then I sit down and I'm writing, and it's actually good. And I'm like, at least it's good for something if I'm feeling terrible, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, completely relate to that. As you know, I've spent years of my life from age 14, 15 onwards playing in bands, playing in mostly rock bands. From quite an early age of doing that, I would be the songwriter of the band. And I always felt that my songwriting was at its best when I was really down about something or really conflicted about something. And certainly in my teenage years, that would normally be to do with relationships. So whilst I would, in my personal life, I might be feeling really depressed, in my band life, I was really delighted because then it gave me real inspiration to write the songs. So yin and
Exactly.
yang.
Works. But I can't imagine how people who are not like that are doing it, you know? And I'm not saying that like everybody needs to be an artist and paint or write or something like that. But I think you can project these feelings into everything. And I wonder how people who don't have hobbies are doing that. I can't imagine because that's how I deal with stuff. When I feel terrible, I sit down and I'm writing, whatever. It doesn't have to be my book. I'm just writing something, anything. And sometimes I wonder how people who don't do that, who don't enjoy it, are dealing with these emotions. But you are not that person, so I probably won't
No,
get answer to
but the
that.
thing is that's what art is for, because you can listen to the songs and that will help you have that release, or you can watch the movies, or you can see a piece of art, or you can read a book. So there is an American guitarist and songwriter, quite well known, and certainly a hero of mine, called Stephen Stills. You may know the name from a band from the 70s and 80s called Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. They were one of the first ever supergroups and just used their surnames to create the name of the group. Stephen Stills, quite early on in his career, said that if you are an artist, and he's a very skilled multi-instrumentalist musician and songwriter, and he said it's your job to provide the outlet for people who can't actually write the songs to be able to express themselves. So you are providing the, if you like, the bridge or the conduit for other people to get their emotions out, because art connects with emotion.
So we spoke about the English, we spoke about the Czech, and now, obviously, we have to speak about Americans because I just find it fascinating, really, the difference between these two cultures and American culture when it comes to emotions, because they are very, very expressive with their emotions. And there is a very strong social encouragement to, process your emotions and vent them and make them visible and validate them and so on and so on, which again, that's obviously a good thing. I think we already established in this episode that neither of us can really do it, or neither of our cultures can really do it. And that makes some trouble sometimes. So I think it's a good thing. But then I think there's a very thin line between, prioritizing the visibility over prioritizing the depth of it. And, emotions are something very complicated, but I think that because of that, they are often sort of simplified into labels, and that the labels are more important than how you actually feel and what it actually means, not for society, but for you and within you and how it makes you feel. But at the same time, being able to do that and being able to label it, I think that it gives you better opportunity to voice it, and not just to yourself, not just to people around you. But I think that this is especially important in therapy. Because the decision to find a therapist is a huge decision. Not everybody is brave enough to do. And I think that especially in my culture and yours, when we are taught that we shouldn't be talking about it, then you obviously don't even think about talking to a professional because you feel like you shouldn't do it. And then if you are actually brave enough to do it, I feel like so many people are not able to articulate. And then obviously you should be able, if you decide to go to therapy, you should be able to label it to a certain point. But we do not live in an ideal world, so obviously, everyone feels differently about it. But again, and this is something we are going back to in every single episode, and that's self-awareness. That you just, even in this case, it's important to realize on what level you are, if you are in touch with what you are feeling, but maybe you don't know how to articulate it. So then it's important to focus on how to name it, or it's the other way around. But that comes to every single person and how much they want to do about it. So I think that what we established today is that your culture and the country you are born in has a lot of effect on how you feel and how you perceive emotions. But it's one of the things that are important to realize. And baby steps. I think that I'm still struggling with it. I don't really trust people. I'm not really opening up to people. But I think that it's important to make these small steps and maybe start with, having one person that you can trust. To have that one friend that you don't have to keep a stiff upper lip with, and with whom you don't have to reply, "Oh, I'm fine," when they ask you, "How are you doing?"
Very, very good point. So let's throw it open to you. What do you think? Stiff upper lip, good or bad?
You can leave us a comment on any platform you are listening at, or you can write us a message at our Instagram at lifehappens.podcast.